Okay, and you can just leave your mics open if you want to jump in at any point. I'll try to periodically just, call pause for things, for questions or comments or reactions, um but don't wait for me to do so because I might just race ahead because there's a lot of stuff in here. Okay. So what we're talking about in this session are some strategies that evidence suggests is effective in reducing equity gaps in student outcomes. And in terms of student outcomes, that means grades, retention, and all those other things that we're when students are concerned about. If you'd like a copy of the slides, and I'd recommend that because there's a link to some resources in here where the resources may be useful if you want to follow this up in any more detail. You can either, let me see if I can just copy that, copy the link address. Yes, and I'll put that right in the chat too. But you can also get it by scanning that code with your camera, just aiming your camera at it, or by typing in that URL. Okay. So, so when we talk about equity gaps, we should talk about the major ones that have been observed, and I'm sure there's many others, but these are the ones that's easiest to keep track of. Um, Race and ethnicity. All colleges keep records of this, and now we have a really nice dashboard on campus that allows us to view many of these things, which our institutional research office has put together by gender, by income. And in general, most of the public statistics on this don't list income, but there is a measure in the databases of Pell eligibility, and that is a fairly important predictor of student success. First gen status turns out to be also incredibly important in terms of predicting outcomes. Um, and here's a measure. Okay, I'm pausing on this because the colors look different than they did on my computer. But in any case, here's just a breakdown by race and by school type of graduation rates. And this is basically 150% of the time that is the official graduation time. So it's 6 years for four-year institutions, and it's 3 years for two-year institutions. And now we talk about them as being four-year institutions, but going back for about 40 years or so, the average time to completion of a four-year degree has been over 5 years. So this is nothing new, and we'd like to see students finishing sooner. But the most important thing here is you notice that Asian students tend to do a bit better. White students are pretty close to that. But then Hispanic students, the proportion of student graduating on time within 50% over the recommended or the time we'd like to use. And for Black students, it's much lower. And there's a really big gap there in all the categories, regardless of whether it's a private four-year institution, a public, or a two-year institution. The private colleges do a little bit better, and that may well be an income effect there because they tend to be a bit more expensive. Now, you notice the rates are a lot lower for 2 years, but on the other hand, many students are going to those not to get a degree, that they're trying to acquire some skills or certificates that can increase their employability. So it's not necessarily saying that they're doing that much worse. It's just it's a very different environment and a different group of students. So we're going to talk about some of the main things that we can do in our classrooms and campuses can try to do to help improve some of these gaps in terms of student success. And one thing that's shown up in hundreds of studies now is that building a sense of community or belongingness significantly reduces equity gaps. That if students feel they belong, if they feel connected to the institution, if they feel connected to their faculty and to each other, they're much more likely to stay. That if students don't have that sense of connection, they're much more likely to give up somewhere along the way. So some of the things we can do. One of the most important things, which is both one of the simplest and also one of the most difficult, is learning names. And the research on this is pretty overwhelming. That if you can use students' names. They're going to feel much more connected. They're more likely to think that you care about them. They're more likely to feel that they're part of the community and so forth. And I say it's in principle, it's a relatively simple thing. In practice, one of the hardest things we can do is learn how to learn names. Michelle Miller came out with a book about a year and a half ago, which is Learning Students' Names. It's a really short book. It came out through the Oklahoma University Press book and press series. And I do have a link to, well, I do have the reference on there. And she also did a few podcasts on that, including one with us. And she has some really simple techniques we can use to work on learning student names. And one thing, in addition to the technique she suggests, is it's really helpful if you look at the schedule that has the roster version that has student pictures on it. Although sometimes they're 3 or 4 year old pictures, and they may not always look like the students do at the time when we have them in their classes. But getting to know students' names is really important. Even if you teach a large class, I was teaching a class of 250 students, and I certainly didn't learn all their names. I know some people are much better at that than I am. But even if you just learn a dozen or 20 student names and you periodically use those names, it creates the impression that you know them more than they realize you do. And if you have a student writing to you who wants to come in and talk about some issue, or they say, "Can I come in and visit you, to talk about this?" or "Your office hours don't work," you can always look up their image in the roster so that you recognize them when they come to your office door. But we do tend to come up with a few students who visit us regularly and we get to know them, but learning as many as we can is a really good, effective tactic. Another simple thing we can do is arrive early and stay late. Now, I used to do this intentionally to be able to chat with students before and after class. Now I do it because with all the multi-factor authentication and all the barriers created in the podium, I have to arrive about 15 or 20 minutes early just to be able to log into iClicker, to log into Zoom, to log into Brightspace, and to log into any other software that I'm using in class with all the multi-factor authentication barriers that are imposed on us. But you can still at least chat with students while you're doing that, and it's a challenge. But if you do stay late, don't get in the way of the next person teaching, because for many years, I was following someone who always left class before their time, and it gave me an extra 5 minutes or so to get set up. It's great to stay and chat with students after class, but let the new instructor come in. That's not building community so much as just, not making the next instructor late. Another really effective strategy is not to stay up at the front of the class at the podium. Wander around during activities. If you have PowerPoint slides, there's lots of apps you can use on phones and so forth to advance the slides. You don't have to be in the front of the classroom. In fact, you're much more likely to get to know more students if you wander around in the back. I get in a lot of steps when I teach in that large class. I did have a broken leg a few years ago, and it was so frustrating because I was using a walker at the start of the semester, and with the tiered classroom, I was stuck at the front, and I got to know far fewer students, and especially those beyond the first 5 or 6 rows. But you can teach from anywhere in the classroom and just interact with students while they're working on things. If you have them work on some small group activities, ask them how it's going, or answer any questions they have, or just listen to how things are going within their groups, and just let them know that you're concerned about them and you want to assist them. But teaching by walking around is a really effective way of getting to know students better, instead of just the students in the front few rows. Um, Another thing you can do and this can work in any type of course modality, is to do a survey of students at the beginning of the class, find out what their interests are, find out what hobbies they have, find out what their career goals are, what their objectives are. And by doing that, you can try to integrate some of those things into examples in your discussions, in your presentations, even in some of your assessment questions and so forth. Because if you can tie that student interest in, you can end up, having more connection with them or giving students more of a connection between what they're learning and their own interests. Um, and the other thing is, if you do that in, say, a discussion forum, for example, students also get to find other students who have similar interests, similar career objectives, and that can help build student to student connections as well. And also let students know how you're available to assist them, whether it's through email, office hours, Zoom online hours, or whatever types of methods you're using to assist students and when you're available. And also let them know when you might not be available. For example, it's not uncommon for students to send emails with questions at midnight or 1 or 2 a.m. and just reminding students that you might not be answering questions after a certain time when you might end up being asleep, for example, so that they don't expect immediate answers, but let them know that you'll try to respond within, say, 12 hours or so. But it may not be immediate if it's during the middle of the night. And a couple of really interesting studies that were done on relatively large samples found that giving personalized feedback to students after the first two graded assessments have a significant impact on student retention. One was done by Elizabeth Canning. I forgot wait, I forgot the names of the other people. White and Davis. They basically found that if this was Davis was the instructor for a large chemistry class, and he provided personalized feedback to students in each of their first two graded assessments. And the feedback was something to the effect that if they did well, praising them that they did well. If they didn't do very well, reminding them that it's common to struggle with this material initially, and reminding them of the resources you have for them that can help them and what other types of support you can provide them. Just doing that ended up having a significant effect on student retention, not just going from this was an entry level course, if I remember correctly. Not only retention, say, from freshman to sophomore year, but they found that people who received this intervention were also significantly more likely to persist through graduation, that the probability of graduation went up by about 5% in the class where this was used, or for the students who got this. This was a randomized control trial. Half of the students had this intervention. The other just had more generic feedback. The students who got this were significantly more likely to still be in the college 5 years later. And it's the interesting thing is they also had a case where they just did it once. One impact or one intervention did not have a significant effect, but the students who received two interventions did have a significant difference in retention rates. And that was especially true for the effect of first-gen students and historically minoritized students. So it was a remarkably powerful effect. And, we can do some of this, in large classes, we can do some of this using the tools available in Brightspace, because we can send targeted emails to students whose grades are on a given assessment or above a certain level or below that. We can insert their names into it and so forth. So, it's a fairly easy intervention that can even be automated, and it can make a significant difference. And, we'd like to see more students being successful. Another study was done by Carell and Kurlander. This was in a large introductory economics class, who also used two personalized messages with a random controlled situation. It was first done It was first done in one institution. They found significant results, and then they expanded it to multiple institutions with a very large sample. And again, half of them got the intervention, half of them didn't. And it significantly, again, reduced racial equity gaps and it increased persistence, particularly for male students. The effect was fairly small for female students. I don't think it was significant, statistically significant, but it did lead to a significant increase in retention rates, both again from freshman to sophomore year, and also again after 4 years, that the proportion of students, the students who got this intervention in the large economics class were much more likely to still be in the college 4 year or to graduate 4 years later. So it's again a fairly simple intervention that makes a difference. It lets them know that you're concerned about the student. It lets students know that you're concerned and that you're able to help them. And again, you can build some growth mindset messages into it. And that was done explicitly in the Canning, White, and Davis study. Any thoughts on any of this? Okay, Michael had said he'd be careful about arriving early and staying late. Complaints from students feeling that being early or staying late made them late to class. Well, yeah, you probably should not hold students later. Um, okay, and then there's a question. Yeah, we don't want to keep students late and so forth. And or exclude them from discussions, but just not rushing out of the room, I think is the most important thing, because there's usually at least a few minutes where students have pressing questions they can get to see you. But yeah, you shouldn't tie students up so they don't get to the next class. I would probably do the emails in Brightspace, because then it's going directly to them and it can be automated, but you could also do it in Starfish too. I'm not sure if Starfish would have the same impact though as doing it right from within the course shell, because I think students may see the Starfish notifications more as a sign that they're in trouble. I may be wrong, but that's just a guess. The notifications going through Starfish are good because they notify other instructors and advisors. And when students are really struggling, that can be really helpful in getting students assistance. But just providing some personalized feedback on the grades can be done really easily and again, automated within Brightspace. So, I, you can in fact, this could be an interesting study. If you have a large enough number of students, you could try one or the other or both and see if there's a significant difference in the outcomes. Okay, so it's something to worth trying. Now, so that helps build community. Okay. Yeah, and Michelle suggests if it's specific to your class, do it in Brightspace. And it that probably seems less punitive and more supportive, perhaps. Well, Starfish doesn't necessarily seem punitive, but if the student just has a bad grade on one assessment, it's probably not worth reporting in Brightspace and in Starfish unless they're really struggling or they're not doing some work or they've disappeared or something like that. Because that's probably a better use of Starfish. But if they just didn't quite do as well as you would have hoped they had done, that might be useful. Yeah, and you could add the note in Starfish if it's important to document for the advisor. Yeah. Okay. So we want to build strong relationships between faculty and students, part of that whole community of inquiry approach. But we also want to build strong student-to-student connections. And one way of doing that is using cooperative or team-based learning activities where you sort students either randomly or by using a neutral criteria. And this follows up really nicely with Dean Croyle's presentation right before this. She had a great session on using cooperative learning activities and ways to do that effectively. And one of the points she made, this was not planned in advance, it just happened to work out on the schedule this way. But one of the things she suggested is that you should either sort students into groups randomly or by using a criteria in which it's neutral well, neutral in the sense that it's not biased towards keeping friends together or keeping students alike together. You want to create diverse groups. And one way in which I've done this in my econometrics or my capstone course is that students come in with both of them have a fair amount of mathematical requirements in it or build on a lot of math. And what I do is I just ask students how many math or stat courses they've had up to that point in their educational project process. And then I sort them on that from highest to lowest. And that way, each group will get some students who have a really strong background in math and stats, and each group will get some people whose background is not quite as well developed yet at that point. And it tends to create somewhat balanced teams and so forth. Um, one of the things Kristen had just talked about in that last session, and something I always recommend too, is not to let students pick their own teams. When students will always prefer to pick their own groups because they know other students in class and they want to work with their friends and so forth. And when students raise that argument, what I always say is, well, how did you get to know these people? And so, well, we took a lot of classes together. So you're saying you have a stronger background in this and you want to work only with students who have a stronger background. And what does that say about the groups where people haven't had as many? And generally, they understand the equity of that. And by doing this also, when you create groups that are for the specific purpose of the class, rather than students who are friends getting together, because I had tried that a few times many years ago. And when students are friends with other people, they tend not to be as focused on the group activities. They tend to be talking about social things. They tend to be talking about their plans for the weekend and so forth. Or they tend to be talking about other things that connect to their friend group. When the groups are formed specifically for the class and they're random and they get to meet some new students, they tend to be much more focused on the specific purpose for which the groups were created. So I strongly recommend creating diverse groups. And by diverse, if there is some level of skill that you want to balance, you can always sort students by that and just count down the list. And I generally do that with a little Google form. I ask them to list the number of courses in a Google form where I put up a QR code, they fill it out, and then I sort it and just go down the list. If there's 6 groups, I just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from highest to lowest according to that criteria. Javed.
Just a quick question, John, regarding the creating groups. So do you make like every time like you have these group projects, so that class you make a different group, or no, you at the beginning you make, group and you assign all those group projects during the semester?
It depends. There are some teams where I use a team-based type approach. I generally don't do the full team-based learning approach, but there are some semester-long projects that I'll create, and those are the ones which most important that you have balanced groups. There are other things where there may be just one activity where students are working together, and there a random process or something similar might work. And it depends on the purpose of the group. For example, in the capstone course, students will often be working on projects where they get to choose a project. In that case, it tends to be, well, I've used a number of approaches. In online classes, I just had them use a discussion board where they suggest things they'd like to work on, and other people would suggest that, and also when they might be available to work. And so I did allow them to self-form groups tied to the projects they were interested in working on. But in the case of groups that are going to be working together, doing presentations throughout the term or working on some other project, there I do tend to use, I put more effort in or more time into trying to create the balance groups. In a large intro class, basically I ask them to turn to whoever's next to them, for when we're doing polling, for example. So that's much less structured and so on. But to even there, to help build community, one of the things I've been doing for about 7 or 8 years now is on the first day of class, I have them do some polls, and I've sent them an email in advance telling them how to, set up the iClicker and so forth, the iClicker thing on their mobile devices or their laptops. And I say, the very first thing I ask them to do is to talk to the people next to them. I said, one of the things you'll notice, they're mostly freshmen, is that people will sit in that same seat all through the semester. In fact, people will get offended if you take their seat or if you move to a different seat. And I said, so, get to know the people around you. And I had them do introductions and talk a little bit about their majors, what their career goals are, and all those things, because those are the students that you're going to be working with on these day-to-day activities. And that can work pretty effectively too. But again, if you have a long-term group, trying to create balance is helpful. Okay, does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, now another thing you can do to help build a community is to give each student the ability to express their own interests or to have some choice. This is also referred to as autonomy supportive instruction. The more choice you give students about how they can display their knowledge and so forth, this is basically two of the three components of the UDL approach. But giving students more choice and more autonomy increases intrinsic motivation. Students get to choose how they present their knowledge. And again, you can do this for the class as a whole, where the whole class chooses it, or you might give students a project such as an unessay project, where they can express, where they are given a topic with specific criteria that they have to demonstrate, but you could let them choose how they're going to display their knowledge. You could give them option, and with an unessay, it's basically anything other than an essay, although people will often still give them an essay option. But they could create a podcast, they could create a board game, they could create a video, they could create well, there are many, many different examples. Maggie, who is the associate director here when she is not expanding her family size as she is this year. But one of the things she's done, or I think she hadn't done it, but it was a criminal justice class, and someone prepared food according to the recipe that they were using in prisons to create this type of prison food, and then shared that with the whole class so they got to see the types of food that people in prisons were eating. They found the recipe and they produced it just to get a feel for what that one aspect of life was like. But there's all sorts of things you can do, but letting students choose the mode in which they display their knowledge and giving them more autonomy and choice of what they're going to be focused on, as long as they're demonstrating the learning skills you want them to have and demonstrating the knowledge and connections you're hoping that they form, giving them choice really increases their motivation. Another thing that's really helpful, both in terms of learning, but also in terms of building community, is doing some peer instruction and peer feedback. A simple thing with clickers that people have been doing ever since Eric Mazur came up with it about 24 years ago is you ask students a question that's somewhat challenging, you let them vote themselves, and then you let them argue it with people who have a different view. So you ask them to find someone who has a different answer, and then each of them is asked to make a case trying to convince the other person, and then listen to what the other person is saying, and then voting again. And they can see that by listening to diverse viewpoints, they're able to do better. That, learning from each other is one of the most effective ways of increasing learning. Eric Mazur had shown that there was, and Carl Wyman have shown that in chemistry and physics, if I remember correctly, there was they did some controlled experiments where some classes use this, others use straight lecture. And they found that the learning gains on a standard concept test were 2 to 3 times larger when students engaged in peer instruction. The act of explaining things to each other increases learning, and it also helps build those connections. encouraging students to get to know each other, we've talked about. And when you do use discussions, use inclusive discussion strategies to make sure that students are all involved in the discussion in some way. Now, if students are very shy, if they're not very comfortable participating, you can give them other ways of doing that. A simple thing could be doing think, pair, shares, where people talk to the people next to them, and then one person will report to the whole group for the group, or could he be, it could be a group of three or four as well. Um, but that way, and you could randomly call on people, but when they're reporting for a group rather than their own personal opinion, they tend to be much more comfortable with that. Because if you ask students to explain some concept or to come to some conclusion based on a scenario, they're often uncomfortable because they don't want to appear to be wrong. But if they're not presenting just their own views, but they're presenting the view of another student or the group decision, it tends to be less threatening, because if it's wrong, it's the group is wrong and not them personally or individually. And also don't just call on the first students who always raise their hands, because it's always the same people who tend to do that. There's a lot of things you could do. You could wait until there's at least three people who raise their hands, or you could wait a certain amount of time, or you could just once someone answers, you could ask someone who hasn't asked the question, such as, who has a different outcome, who has a different viewpoint on that. And that builds a little bit more diversity into the class discussion in terms of differing viewpoints. But try to hear from all your students. And that's one of the nice things that discussion boards can do, because in a discussion board, whether it's done in a face-to-face class or in an online class, what happens is that it feels more anonymous. Well, let me rephrase that. One factor is that it will feel a little bit more comfortable because there's that delete key. If they haven't expressed things quite as clearly as they wanted, they can keep hitting delete until they get a more polished statement. Some people always want to say the first thing on the top of their head, whether it's right or wrong, and other people are a little bit more contemplative. They want to think about it a little bit more, and using discussion boards can do that. And also, that's another good use of polling, where everyone gets to state their views, and you can display them, but it's displayed without the names of the students. So they have that feeling of anonymity. They're not feeling as embarrassed to be wrong about something if they happen to be incorrect. Small group activities are really helpful. If you just have a whole class discussion, you're only hearing from one student at a time. If you have think, pair, shares, or even just groups of three or four, at least each student is getting, well, either twice, is getting able to, in the case of think, pair, share, they're getting half of the time talking on it, rather than just 1 out of 50 if you have a class of 50 students, et cetera. So that's a good way of getting discussions, and it's also um, it helps learning. But if you do have small groups and they're persistent, make sure you rotate who reports, records, et cetera. So you can have roles that rotate every week or every class period, or however you choose to do it. So it's not always the same people doing the same work. And try to provide balanced participation in these groups or in the discussions. When you talk about concepts, try to come up with examples that connect to everybody. And that's one of the cases where having some knowledge about students' interests, backgrounds, and so forth can help you use some examples. Don't talk about those trips you had over the weekend on a neighbor's yacht, for example. That's not going to it's not going to connect to most faculty, but it's also not going to connect to a lot of students. But use examples that bring in all the students, or it may connect to all the students' backgrounds in some way. And better yet, let students generate the example, come up with a concept, and then ask them to think about ways in which they've observed this in their own lives. And again, have them discuss it with each other and then do some sharing. And that can be really effective. Um, Avoid practices that generate stereotype threat. This has pretty much gone away. This was popular about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and I still hear people occasionally talking about it. This was used to demonstrate society's inequity, where you'd have all the students in your class line up, and you'd say, everyone who has both parents present in the household, take a step forward, or everyone who only has a single parent, take a step back, one or the other, or everyone who has taken a vacation out of the state, step forward, et cetera. How many families have two cars, let's say, or something similar? And what it would do is you'd spread the class out essentially from the wealthiest to the poorest, and that was popular a while back, and it was a really harmful practice because what it's showing is inequities in your student body, which is not that, so that some students are coming out as being disadvantaged, and you don't want to convey that message. You want to build on the diverse strengths of your students and not emphasize the inequities that they've experienced in general, because that's more likely to generate stereotype threat. So I don't think many people do it anymore, but it was pretty popular for a while. In general, decolonize your curriculum. Try to find as many diverse examples as you can of different writers, different viewpoints, and so forth. And if in many disciplines, including economics, there's not as much of that as we might see in some other areas. But if you just do a search for decolonize and then your subject area, you'll often find websites of groups of people who have come up with some diverse readings that allow you to cover the same concepts or address the same concepts from different perspectives. And if you can find perspectives that represent a wider mix of your student body, that again is more likely to make people feel more part of the community and so on. But again, even if you can't, if you can get students to state their own views and their own examples and make their own connections, that's automatically helping them form connections where they're not trying to make connections to experiences that are not ones that they've experienced in general. Have them form their own connections so they can connect what they're learning to things they observe in their day-to-day lives. Well, that's what I just suggested. Okay. Growth mindset. The evidence on growth mindset's really incredible. There's so many studies that when students have a growth mindset, they're more likely to be successful. And to the extent to which we can help students believe that by working harder, they can learn, they can be more successful, the more likely they are to be successful. Growth mindsets are basically believing that if you work hard at something, you can become better at it. A fixed mindset is one where we see some faculty who have that, who believe that you're either good at something or you're not good at something. And when I hear those discussions with some of our faculty, it's frustrating, because we want the research shows that when students have a growth mindset, they're much more likely to succeed. If they have a fixed mindset, whether they think they're being successful or not successful, they're less likely to try challenges. They're less likely to try to push the boundaries on their learning. And if they thought they were really good at something and then they have a low grade on something, they're really likely to give up. Or they're really likely not to try. And we all have fixed mindsets on some things, but we hear from our students, I'm not a math person, or I'm not a creative person, or I'm not an artistic person, or I'm not a social person, whatever. But basically encouraging students to recognize that part of the learning process is trying things, making mistakes, and learning from those mistakes. And that's how progress is made in all disciplines, that we try things, we find what works, what doesn't work, and then we learn from that and build on that. And, it's helpful if we can help students see that. There was, and one thing you can do is talk about some examples from your own past experience where you may have tried something and didn't do well, but you were able to get beyond that, and how, it was difficult at the time, but it led to you growing in that area, for example, or something like that. And there's all sorts of examples you can use for that. Using low stakes or no stakes assessments where students can make mistakes without any grade penalty or very small grade penalty. giving students the opportunity for trying things, making mistakes, and then redoing them so that they can demonstrate that they have mastered it within reason so that you're not overburdening yourself and burning yourself out. Um, and Angela Bauer, who actually is someone who had worked with Scott at our I was going to say our provost, but our long-term provost back at Green Bay. And she had done some really good work both at Green Bay and High Point in terms of building a growth mindset in her students. She was the chair of I believe it was it was either chemistry or biology department. We talked to her a while back about this. And what happened was each week she created a slide that contained a growth mindset example, and she shared that with all the faculty teaching those introductory classes. And just one slide that was put somewhere in their presentation that week ended up leading to a significant reduction in student failure, dropouts, and all those other things. That just reminding students that struggling is part of learning had a significant impact on student success and retention. And furthermore, it reduced it effectively in that particular study, eliminated the equity gaps that were occurring by race, by gender, by first gen status, and so forth. So it can be really effective. That was one of the largest effects that were found. Canning, White, and Davis, that other study I mentioned before, also found that building a growth mindset through those messages significantly increased student success and retention. Um, but Elizabeth Canning and a few other researchers had also done some really interesting work on faculty mindset, where in elite private college, she and her co-authors surveyed faculty using an index of faculty mindset. And what they found was, I think she was the lead author on it, but what they found basically was that if your faculty had a fixed mindset, you didn't do as well in your classes. You were more likely to get lower grades. You were more likely to not be retained. You were more likely to drop out. If your faculty had a growth mindset, on average, your grades were better in that class and also in other classes, and you were more likely to stay at the institution, less likely to disappear. Um, and furthermore, while that benefited everyone, the effect was especially large for those students who normally experience these equity gaps. The effect was larger for first gen students, for Pell eligible students, and for historically minoritized groups. And it made a significant difference. The effects were fairly large in magnitude compared to most other educational intervention. So just believing in your students that they can be successful can make a difference. If you believe your students won't be successful, they'll be picking up on that, whether you say that explicitly or not. And that's an important issue. It makes a big difference. These are things we talk about in many, many workshops, but these are kind of the big four. The first three have been around the longest, but what the research tells us is the more practice we give students in retrieving information, the more likely it is that they'll remember it, and the greater is their ability to take concepts learned in one application and transfer it to other applications, to make connections across similar domains of knowledge. Space practice, the more you spread out the studying, the learning, the more that you tend to recall. And there's so many studies on that. I have citations to these in another document. Interleave practice is when you mix up the learning a little bit. That's compared to block practice, where with most textbooks and probably most courses are designed with block practice, where, for example, in a math textbook, you learn one technique, you apply it over and over again, and once you get past that, you move on to a different concept, which may build on it, it may not, it may be completely different. And that's also true in economics classes and many others. You learn something, you use it, and then you move on to another topic, and then you leave the old one behind. Interleave practice is one where you mix up the assessments and you mix up the practice of those things so that, if you learn one type of technique, and you master it, you come back and get tested on it again. Students don't like that, by the way. Students do not generally like frequent retrieval practice. They don't like space practice. They'd rather learn something, take a test on it, pass it, and then put it behind them. But the more you can spread out the learning, the more practice they have with working materials, the more they're going to remember. And they tend to forget things really rapidly if they only approach them once. And in terms of interleave practice, the classic study on this was one where students were given short videos, presentations on how to, I think they were like 10 minutes, on how to measure the volume of four different types of geometric objects. One was a spear, one was a pyramid, one was a cone, and one was something else. I forgot what it was. And what happened was, in each case, they learned how to measure the volume, and then they had some questions on it. But in half of the students, they learned how to measure the volume and they were given various problems applying it. Then they learned the next one, and then they were given problems on it, and so forth for all four of those objects. And in that was the control group. The treatment group, they were exposed to interleave practice, where they watched all the videos for all the four objects, and then they were tested on all of them together with exactly the same questions, but randomly mixed in. And what they found was that students did much better on the initial tests when they used block practice, when we basically plugged the same sort of numbers into the same equation repeatedly, then moved on to a different thing. But then they were tested a week later, and the students who had block practice forgot virtually everything within a week. The students who had the interleave practice, where they had to not only figure out how to plug the numbers into the formula, but they had to recall which formula it was that was relevant. They ended up doing much, much better. And in fact, the scores on the second attempt a week later was higher than they had when they were faced with the same questions a week before. Because basically, it's one of those desirable difficulties that Bjork and Bjork talk about, that the more you struggle to master a concept, the deeper your learning tends to be, and the more likely it is that it will stick. And metacognitive reflection is basically if students reflect on the learning and the process of learning and just are reminded of what they've learned, it tends to increase the amount that they recall. A simple example of this was a study done by some economists, well, by one economist actually, where he had two sections of a class, one in which he used a 1-minute paper at the end of the class where he asked students just to report on what they learned, what they struggled with, and what they don't and I forgot, there was one other thing, but there's a whole variety of options like that. The students who had that, and half of them had that in one section, the other half did not, controlling for other factors, the students who had to answer those questions ended up doing much better on the final exam in the class than the students who didn't. Just reflecting on the learning at the end of class for a minute or two tended to increase the amount that they were able to recall. Now, the results are a little bit mixed. Some disciplines found very little effect from that type of experiment, but in general, there's a lot of evidence that reflecting on your learning tends to increase learning. So, and that tends to be true for us as well. So think of some ways of building these into your course structure. Students may not like it, but explain to them why you're doing it and how that may be helpful. And, if you can show them that that's working, it's helpful. We're running a little short on time, but adaptive learning, personalized learning, mastery learning, it goes by different names and there's all similar variants. But basically, all of our students come in with different backgrounds. Some are really strong in the knowledge of some concepts, and others are strong in others. And when we teach our typical classes, we're kind of teaching to the average student. And where some students are spending a lot of time working on things they already understand well, and they don't get to spend as much time on the things that they're not understanding. If we can create more personalized pathways where students are able to use their time more efficiently by addressing those concepts they don't know as well and developing those skills, they're going to do a lot better than if we just treat all students as if they're alike in terms of their background. That will mean that students with a weaker background have to spend a bit more time on it. And it's probably not a bad idea to tell them that, saying, some of you had a stronger background and some of this you've already seen. If you haven't yet, you're all capable of doing this, but it's going to take a little bit more work. But once you do this, you'll be ready for the next level of classes. And that's something I do talk about because I do use a Waymaker personalized learning platform in my course and in my introductory course. And I say, you've had different backgrounds. Some of you ended up learning a lot because your classes were well funded. You had an instructor who was able to develop those skills in you. Others may not have had that same experience, but you're all capable of doing it. It's just if you don't have a stronger background, it's going to take a bit more work. You don't know that yet, but you will. And reminding them of that periodically. There's a lot more here, but I don't want to. Well, what I'm going to say, just dealing with poverty is really important. When resources are scarce, students struggle. Providing more structure in class is really important. The slides will address all these, and this was probably better as a 2 or 3 hour session. But if you have the slides, click on that link. It'll take you to a Google Drive that has links to the studies and some podcasts where all these topics are addressed, and you can find out more about them if you're interested. Any other things that you have? Oh, okay. Is there follow-up on students retaining materials from Alex, which uses block practice, and Cengage, which uses less? My understanding was that Alex, in fact, did use interleave practice, at least in some of the material, because that was something that in space practice, because I remember students complaining that they were asked about questions that they already had had. So my understanding was that Alex is an adaptive learning package, which it does some block practice, and but I'm not sure. Okay, it makes students do 3 times correctly before they can move on. But doesn't it also go back and randomly bring some of those questions in later in the course to give it a little bit of spaced and interleave practice? I think so. Well, but that's something students complain about, but it should work. Um, the other thing you were saying was what was the other? I'm sorry, I scrolled by for a second. Okay, Pearson and Cengage, they're generally adaptive learning platforms, which should be similar in a lot of ways. Um, the learning, the benefits of Alex in both chemistry and math have been documented a fair amount in terms of student learning, student success, and so forth. I'm not sure how well they hold up with the availability of AI tools, but prior to AI tools being available, there's a number of studies which showed that both the adaptive learning platforms provided by Pearson, Cengage, and other providers and Alex are fairly successful in terms of increasing student learning. And my understanding was, well, from what I recall in some of those studies, that students who had worked through courses that relied on Alex ended up with higher retention rates and higher scores on subsequent classes compared to those who had not participated in it. But I haven't looked at any of those studies recently. Those were mostly probably 7 or 8 or 10 years ago. And again, with generative AI, I'm not so sure how well that's going to work because, there are browser extensions that will basically answer any question on the screen. So, but that's true for any of these types of testing things or these types of adaptive learning platforms. But doing questions 3 times correctly before they move on would be effectively a form of retrieval practice. They have to recall how to do it and so on. But it may be more blocked than I realized. Okay, well, and actually we've got another session coming up, and if you can, please attend the next one. It's with Trisha. Trisha Bertram Gallant, I believe, who is one of the authors of The Opposite of Cheating. Okay, I'll be
Thank you,
right back.
John.
Thank you.